All right. Hey, everybody. Thanks for joining us for another weekly strategy session. This time, I and Jordan and I are joined by Danny and Max Steinberg to really just dig into a topical subject, which is the small slates for NBA and specifically the playoff slates right now. There's definitely some unique considerations to have for these contests. And frankly, I was kind of surprised to see how big they've been. And so I think there's a lot of good opportunity out there, even at the high buy-ins, but even at the smaller stakes, there's still been some really good contests with good payout structures. And I would definitely give these some thoughts. And so what we're going to do is just be pretty quick on some high-level thoughts that we have around how to approach these contests. But then for the most part, we're just going to go into your questions. And one of the big things I know Jordan has talked a lot about in our office hours sessions is we're doing these live for a reason. We really want to get some dialogue going. So if we give an answer that doesn't make much sense or it begs another question, ask those questions. Let us know. We'll be keeping an eye on Slack and in YouTube so that we can see everything that's going on and just get a good idea of where we need to expand. We'll do as best as we can to get to everything. And so to do that within the hour, let's just jump right into things. And I'll actually kick it over to you, Max. What I know you have some thoughts on just how to philosophically approach these slates, or at least like what not to do. Can you just talk a little bit about how you think about these kind of slates? And first, I guess, just to clarify, what we're talking about is really the 3, 2, and 1 game slates. I guess the 4 game slates, there's some thought about that as well, but those are the pool is a bit bigger on that, so it's a bit different. But for these smaller slates, how are you thinking about them, Max?
Yeah, so I would say that my general philosophy in these small slates that's a little different than a bigger slate is you really want to make sure that you're taking a stand in some way, right? You need to do something more than just, projecting everyone as correctly as possible and just building lineups. Because the issue is you're going to get probably pretty similar lineups to the field. And as a lot of you might know or may not know, having a duplicated lineup can be really, really bad in these tournaments because you end up splitting the top prize with a lot of people and it makes your lineup not have that much upside to make money. So there's a few ways to sort of go about that I'll just sort of just say off the top of my head, which is one, you can do that with a pure salary lineup construction approach where you're leaving salary on the table, making it so you have a lineup because it's leaving $1,000 or even $2,000 of salary on the table that it's going to be unique. You can take a stand on a player that might be a diamond in the rough. A lot of times during these slates, I'll sort of hunt in our projections for some of these low minute guys that are on the cusp of being value plays, and then go to a site like Popcorn Machine and do some research and say, okay, is there some way that some of these low minute guys who are like high output players could get more minutes? And if they get more minutes, that means they actually could be the play of the slate that's going to win you a tournament. And then the last thing is choosing someone to fade, right? A lot of these slates will have players that get really, really high ownership, like 50, 60, 70%. And there's some situations, especially if they're value plays, where they can really fail and really just screw someone up. And if they do that, then you can that's a huge advantage for you. I'd say the same thing in a showdown slate with the captain spot, right? Like, let's say tonight a popular captain is LeBron, and I don't know that that's going to be the case, but if Anthony Davis gets ruled out, that might be the case. And if we think, okay, well, LeBron has kind of been injured and he could have a really bad game, that can be a huge advantage too, because he's going to be a popular captain, and you can end up getting a huge advantage by just completely fading someone like him, playing someone else, and having those games where they get blown out and LeBron just like, screw this, So I think those are the 3 basic looks that I'm going for when looking at these slates.
And actually, before we jump into questions, I'm curious if you would mind just walking through a bit of your process around finding some of those low minute, high upside plays where you could take an aggressive stand on. Because I think that's one where it's not going to be as intuitive for people. I think
Sure.
leaving a lot of salary on the table, we
screen?
can get into like, if you don't mind. Yeah.
Sure.
Yeah. I think with the others, it's like leaving a lot of salary on the table. The smaller the slate, the more you want to leave. It's kind of a blunt weapon, but it works to eliminate the likelihood of dupes, fading high on plays. There's still some, it's not completely straightforward, but I feel like this last one that you mentioned is where there's a bit more nuance. Yeah, so if you just want to share your screen, I can toss it up here.
Okay, let's see.
All right.
Okay, is that working?
Yep.
Okay, so let's just start. So we have this sort of nice thing that maybe some of you are not aware of, where you can actually look at the components of what makes players' projections. So we project literally everything. That's what goes into these fantasy player projections. And so something that I like to do is sort of just look at some of these lower projected plays and see who has sort of like a high projection compared to their minutes. People are standing out here. Paul Millsap is someone, Marcus Howard, maybe someone like Marc Gasol. So those are just three that really quickly stand out. Maybe Monty Morris as well. And you look at them and I say, okay, these are a couple players that could be very good value plays if their minutes go up. And I sort of then just go to popcorn machine. Like someone like Paul Millsap really stands out to me, right? Because he has a 16 fantasy point projection in only 15 minutes. So he's a really high output player. So for some reason, there's some signal to me that Paul Millsap could play more minutes, that he could be a really interesting play. And I think actually what's interesting, just thinking about this, is Denver and Portland did play a double overtime game. And while Portland this is an elimination game for them, for Denver it's not. And so it is sort of interesting to see is maybe they will ride some of these guys who didn't play like 43 minutes 2 games ago. So I think someone like Millsap could be a really interesting play because, right now we're just projecting him at sort of the minutes that he's getting, recently, which is it's like 12, 14. He doesn't play a lot. But because it's a special situation, I think in playoffs especially, I'm sorry for this, in playoffs especially, you can get these situations where, given the momentum of the playoffs, if the team has lost a couple games, they may make a change up, like Dallas with Boban Marjanovic they started. So you'll see these changes happening as this sort of dynamics of the 7-game series go on. And so I think that's a really interesting one. And just basically by looking at that and looking at Popcorn Machine, you can sort of uncover these plays.
And let me know if I'm off base here, but I guess the way I'm wrapping my head around it is that it's not as though you couldn't find low minute, high upside plays on larger slates or find other areas like this to take a stand. It's just that you don't really need to. There are enough opportunities on a bigger slate where you can find edge without complicating things or without really digging deep. But as the player pool goes down, you have to find something to get that edge to overcome.
It's just way more important, right? It's like, if, and I'm not touting here, I'm just saying, like, I haven't even looked at the slate. So I just literally was thinking about this as we were going through it, right? But, if you can uncover a play that where some guy is projected at 16 points and he really should be 17 points because of the dynamics that are going to be really hard to take into account when you're using a model based on historical data. If you can change him to 17, that could raise his ownership from like 20% to like 80%. It's a really important thing. So on a bigger slate, raising someone's projection of point could be completely irrelevant. He might not even be considered anyway. But in this, every player can be such a pivot point because, a point or two in projection can lead to quite a bit more ownership for your lineups.
And then Danny, I know you do a lot with messing around with the salary cap. How, just broadly speaking, how are you looking at that? Like, how aggressive do you get by lowering the maximum? What are sort of just rules of thumb that you would apply there?
Yeah. So as Max was saying earlier, I think having a lineup that's going to be unique or having as few dupes as possible in these top heavy tournaments is really important for your expected value. With like something like baseball and football, I tend to be more aggressive with lowering the max salary because there's so many ways that players can fail, whether it's just they have a bad game or they get injured. Football injuries happen all the time. There's a lot more variance in those sports. With basketball, there's not a lot of variance, or it's one of the least variant sports, and there's people don't get injured as much, and just people don't have just absolutely horrible games as much, unless there's foul trouble or something. So there's kind of more of a balance there. I think with something like small slate basketball or showdown, I may leave like 500, 600 on the table to give myself a higher chance of having a more unique lineup. But I don't want to do it so much that I have a lineup that literally like it has it's where it's too much of a trade-off and a lineup is projected too badly to really have a good shot at winning. You kind of want to find that sweet spot where you have a lineup that you think has a high chance of being unique or little duped, and also you think could easily have a chance of like winning the whole slate.
For sure.
So with you guys talking about how the edge can be a little bit harder to find in some of these showdowns and smaller slates, is this something where you would recommend, or you typically find yourself adjusting your contest selection strategy or bankroll management strategy in terms of how much you guys go at these slates?
Oh, for sure. I mean, I think one of the cool parts about these small slates is if you have like if you feel really strongly about one player, that can be a big source of edge. But often, you're not going to have like one player that you think is massively under or over projected in a really small slate. So I think when that's the case, play the contest under $3. I think limit the amount of entries you're doing. And the amount of lineups you're doing, because there's only going to be so many profitable lineups you can make for, a 2-game slate or a showdown slate.
I think that's such a great point with just, it depends on what you're thinking, right? If you go through the slate, like don't even enter contests until you've taken a look at the slate, because if you see something, you go, oh my God, I think this is just I found an amazing play. Okay, well then enter more contests, like take more risk. But if you look at the slate and you go, I don't have any thoughts beyond what I'm seeing SaberSim's project, like it seems like everything's great. Everyone seems on the play that I like. Everyone on Twitter is talking about it. You just don't enter very many contests because you know that your edge is not going to be as high, right?
Right. And I think for basketball, like an example of where, like if someone's played horribly and gotten in foul trouble like every game for the past 5 games, and you see that he's like criminally underprojected, that's a situation there where maybe there's edge, or maybe there's some other motivation angle or some angle that where the coach has said this guy's going to get really involved, or I'm going to play him a lot, and the projections haven't picked up on that. That can be a source of edge too. There's definitely like times where you can find a player who can be really misvalued.
And to get a little specific, like, is there ever a time where you would be maxing out a showdown? And obviously, if the pricing just seems horrible across the board, sure. But in most situations for NBA, would you ever consider maxing out a showdown?
If I had like a super good angle, I had super high.
No, like if it was like, I mean, because I feel like those angles, the pricing is relatively good. In the playoffs, there's not a ton of surprises. So I just feel like the edge is going to be smaller. So on a standard slate, unless something exceptional comes out, would you be maxing it out, or would just
not at all?
Yeah.
But if there's tons of overlay, that's a time where maybe you'd max it out. But if there's not overlay, then no. I just chances are you're not going to be able to make like 150 profitable lineups for a showdown basketball contest. It's probably going to be more like 20 or something like that.
Yeah. Do you agree with that, Max?
Yeah, I agree with that. The only exception is in NFL. I think I think that when the sport's more high variance, you're going to find better edges, and basketball is not that high variance. So if I would say every other slate, I sort of look at it and I go, I don't really know what direction what kind of stand I would take here. So it just all depends. But yeah.
And I think that's an important point to hammer home, is that if you're just looking for a gamble, you just want to put some money in and have some break-even-ish EV, like that's fine. You just want to sweat, play the showdowns and just don't go crazy with it. But if you are really playing this to get a consistent edge, you have to go in with the idea that not every slate is going to be profitable for showdown basketball. I think as more games get added to the slates, when you get to 2 and 3, you can usually find some edge. But all those times, don't just go in and max everything out. Don't just go in and assume that you're going to be able to put in the same number of lineups. Like, take some thought to that. Yeah, go for it, Jordan.
Yeah, I'll just jump in there too. I mean, we've talked a little bit in office hours too, right? If losing every lineup you enter that night is going to make you feel bad at the end of the night, then NBA showdowns are not the contests for you, right?
Yeah.
Like, it's when you're finding those edges and pushing an edge on maybe a low owned minutes upside guy. If he doesn't get into the game, you're going to lose, and it doesn't mean that those lineups were built or constructed in a poor way for that contest. On the contest selection thing too, one thing I'll add is, play some of those single entry contests and play some of those 3 maxes that are at your appropriate dollar range, and under $3 is even better, right? The edges, the small edges you might find in some of the big multi-entry contests are going to be exaggerated in the single entry, right? So maybe taking a stand on the highest projected on play of the night is going to go a lot further in a contest where everyone only has one lineup to play with.
And on that note, we definitely have gotten a good amount of questions about single entry contests. And I know this is something that I know you've covered in office hours. I think we've had a few videos on it as well. And there's going to be some nuance to single entries, but I frankly think the average player overcomplicates it and thinks they're building entirely different lineups for these single entry contests versus a 20 maxer versus a 150 max. And sure, if you were to look at a winner take all satellite versus a flat payout structure single entry, the lineups are definitely going to be a bit different. For small slate NBA, I don't think the lineups are going to be dramatically different for no matter how many, like the size of the contest, just because there aren't that many combinations you can make. There's not a lot you can do there. But I was curious if you guys had any thoughts on that, on the single entry aspect. Like, are there any things that you actually think need to be noticeably different for that versus a standard higher cap contest?
I don't think so. I think it's mostly the same. I mean, there's very small nuances, I think. Like, the field's going to be a little bit softer. The ownerships probably aren't going to be as concentrated.
Right.
But it's mostly the same. I think it's not important to think about those nuances.
I would just say the only thing that I keep in mind is to not do anything. It's to still treat it like a GPP, because I feel like some people they get in single entry and they just get risk averse for some reason, which is kind of the opposite of what you should do.
They put in their cash lineup.
Right, which is not smart.
No, yeah, and that's reflected in the default sliders too, right? You'll see very subtle differences between the single entry slider settings and the 20 max and the 150. So the good basis there to work from.
Yeah, and we did get some questions about just adjusting the sliders or trusting the defaults. And frankly, I think this is something where if you aren't as familiar with our product, we have sliders that incorporate, we have settings that incorporate correlation, ownership, and smart diversity in your lineups. And we adjust those defaults for you based on the size of the slate and the contests that you tell us you're playing. And if it's almost one of those things where, like, if you're asking if you should adjust it, the answer is probably no. But there is more nuance to that, where I would almost never start by trying to mess with the sliders. But I know, Max, especially, like you do make some tweaks here or there. So on these smaller slates, like, are you making any adjustments to the sliders? And if so, can you just elaborate on what might cause that?
On the smaller slates, I would say, the slider that I'm always most likely to make adjustments to is the ownership slider. But that's mostly because it depends on what I'm doing, right? Like if I'm taking a stand on someone, then I'm not worried about getting as much ownership fade because I already feel like I'm getting the ownership fade that I need. If I'm going to do that, and then I might just lower ownership fade a little bit.
Just by excluding a highly owned player, like that's
right, exactly. It's like I'm already fit. It's sort of like doing it doubly when I don't want to do that, right? So sometimes I'll do that, or if I have no angle at all, I might just raise it more because I'm sort of like, okay, well, I want to fade somehow, so let's see what this SaberSim algorithm basically is going to do. And I think also in these small slates, I love when smart diversity is very high, especially towards the top. So even in a 3-game, because A, it's going to get me diversity, and B, it's going to get me those lineups where in very specific game outcomes, like if we're basing these lineups on one simulation or a few, that they're optimized for specific outcomes. So I think raising that slider, I'm always, I'm pretty sure if I'm looking at the defaults, it's like one from the top, but I know where it looks like the default is literally at the top. So, but I'm definitely very happy about that because that's something that I want to do.
And on a similar note, someone had asked, should I take more aggressive stands with locks and full fades of players on smaller slates, or try to spread out and get exposure to everyone? And we pretty much already addressed that, but I'm curious your view on, like, say there is that player you're taking a stand on, and you don't literally lock them in, but they're in 80% of your lineups or something like that, and the field has them 20% of the time. Are you thinking about diversifying the rest of it, the lineup around that, or just you really just it's not a big factor in your decision other than that stand?
I am not that risk averse. So I think it just depends how risk averse you are. I think when it's not like I'm going crazy on these slates, right? So especially on a showdown slate, I'm not risking a very large portion of my bankroll at all, like very small portion of my bankroll. It's something where it's like, if I lose, I don't care. Like it doesn't really matter. So if you're playing these showdown slates, and as Jordan said, like you zero, like you do not cash in anyone, and that's upsetting, I play less because it's something you're in a risk. So for me, and for some people it's fine. It's like, okay, I don't want to it would really be heartbreaking if I went 80% of this player, I would have got that one lineup that did really well. So I think it can make sense to focus on diversifying, but we're also going to do that a little bit for you because of smart diversity being so high. So I don't really worry about it.
Mm-hmm. That makes sense. And we talked last week a bit about Vegas and sports betting in general, but also how that can apply to DFS. And this was, Jordan, do you want to share the question that came in around that?
Yeah. So we had talked last week about some of the signals we can get from Vegas and using some of the trends of the way lines are moving throughout the day to influence some of the projections. We had a question come in earlier this week about when applying that to NBA, are you more or less likely to adjust projections based on Vegas trends when you're looking at just a single game or a very small NBA slate compared to maybe something like a more traditional 12-game regular season slate?
I mean, I think, sure. Yeah, I think it's maybe easier to take the line movements into consideration on a smaller slate because you don't have to research as many teams. So, I mean, in general, with line movement, you kind of just want to follow the steam. Basically, most of the betting that's going on in these games are smart people betting. And when they move the line, it's because a smart person has bet the other side. So as far as taking Vegas stuff into consideration, you want to look at basically whether the line is moving towards the over or the under, or whether it's moving towards a team. Basketball is really straightforward. Like if a team is scoring more points, does better offensively, and is doing better defensively, they're going to get more fantasy points. So if the steam is heading on or towards the direction of one team, let's say, like, theoretically, I don't know what the line movement is. Well, maybe I can just look at it really fast. But if, like, the line, if you saw line movement moving towards the Lakers tonight strongly, like it moved a few points, let's say, and I would want to probably raise some Lakers players and maybe lower some Phoenix players. If it's moving towards the over, you can raise people in both games. If it's moving towards the under, slow pace, that's worse for fantasy points because there's less opportunities. So maybe you would lower people.
not necessarily a counterpoint, but I'm curious when it comes to taking a stand. It seems like this could be a place to take a stand where I wouldn't do it blindly, because I think you are right that most of the time you're going to have like follow the steam. That's smart money. But I guess how would you think about that, Max, if you have any thoughts too on like when it makes sense to take a stand? Because taking a stand in general, that's what's valuable on these smaller slates. Like, are there spots where you might go against Vegas, not purely to be unique, but how would you look at that?
I get what you're saying. I mean, I would say specifically on playoff basketball, I think there can be motivation stuff that might change the lines. That's going to be hard for us to take into account. So I think more than ever, you can trust the line movement. But I get what you're saying. Like, I know there's a lot of times during the regular season where there will be like Brooklyn versus some other high-powered offense. The over-under, it'll be like Wizards Nets or something. And the over-under will be like 245 and it'll move to 250. And in that case, a lot of times everyone is aware of this, right? They're like, oh, this is going to be a high-scoring game. People are betting that it's going to be a high-scoring game. And that's a place where you might be able to take advantage and say, okay, I'm not going to value these players as highly because I think their ownership is going to be up. So I feel like it's almost better when it's subtle. There's like sort of a sweet spot. But in general, I mean, if that happens, it probably is going to actually be a high-scoring game. And so there's a balance. But I get what you're saying is if it's a line movement and the line movement is like in agreement with the public and and daily fantasy Twitter, then maybe that's a sign where you're like, okay, I'm not going to do anything here because I actually feel like these players are not going to get over.
Yeah, and you touched on this a little bit in that example, but what are some of the differences between the regular season games and playoffs for NBA?
I just think the difference is, when these series are just different because their star players are playing 40 plus minutes. And in the regular season, that's more of a wild card. You don't know what's going to happen. And so there's sort of more regression to the mean, or maybe teams are not taking it as seriously. So in these playoff slates where, it's like we know LeBron James might legitimately, in some situations, play the whole game. He's done that in the playoffs, right? Or something like that. I remember there's some finals where the Cavaliers kept being favored against the Warriors, and it's because they literally did not take LeBron out of the game. And when you have a situation like that, there can just be differences that are hard to capture in a model that, might be just better to follow, basically. It's more sharp.
Yeah, I think just going off of what you're saying, with playoffs, you do see people projected 40, 41, 42 minutes, maybe even 44 minutes. And the distribution of outcomes is not going to be a normal distribution. There's going to be like if it's a regulation game, a person can only get 48 minutes maximum. Right. So these players who have really high minute projections, they're not actually going to have as much upside as you would think. And I believe SaberSim will be able to capture that through the simulations that, hey, if this guy has an upside minutes game, he may only get 2 or 3 more minutes than we're projecting. But, there could be a guy at like 25, 26 minutes where it's possible they get 33, 34 minutes. So there tends to be more upside with the lower minutes guys than with the super high minute projected guys.
Right. And just to clarify a little on that, with normal distribution, basically it's a bell curve, and it says an event that, say, someone is projected at a really high minutes total, you're saying that they have the same likelihood of getting 10 minutes above as they have getting 10 minutes below that total if it was a normal distribution. However, there's the floor for minutes is 0. And there's also a ceiling that is not that far off from some of the projections. And so that's where you just have to be aware of like what the potential actually could be. And Danny, one thing I know you've been doing a decent amount of recently, or at least last few weeks, is late swap. Can you talk a little bit about your late swap strategy, if it's different than for the regular season? Obviously, with the schedules being a little different, you're thinking about it slightly differently. But like, what does that look like for you in playoff basketball? Like, if the questionable players are in the last game of the night, how are you building your lineups, or what do you think about for late swap?
Yeah, so as Max said earlier, kind of, if someone goes from projected at like 13 fantasy points to 15, that may mean you want them in like 50% of your lineups versus 0%. So any injury that happens or any starting lineup change can really make a difference on what your optimal lineups are. So yeah, I think it's really impactful. Like if someone's starting that you didn't expect to start, maybe see how SaberSim updates their projection, maybe project them a little more, and definitely don't be afraid to do late swap. And because, there could be a new play that's really worth playing that may not even get that much ownership. So it could be a good upside decision too.
And are you building that initial build differently in the case of having a handful of questionable players in the last game?
Yeah, for sure. So like if there's someone questionable, and if they're out, someone's going to be a really good play. If you're too heavy on the first game, you may not have an opportunity to put this guy in your lineups or into a lot of lineups. So if there's someone like today with the Lakers is a perfect example, Caldwell Pope and Davis are questionable. I would lower Denver and Portland players in this situation, because if there is an injury, if both Davis and Caldwell Pope are out, there's going to be a lot of really good plays on the Lakers that you're going to want to play, and it won't be worth playing those borderline guys on Denver and Portland. And if they're both in, then whatever, you still are having good lineups. But you want to give yourself that opportunity to get some really good plays in your lineup if both those players end up being out, or questionable players end up being out.
Yeah, and just adding on to that real quick too, in the case that those players are in, a lot of times, what we're seeing is that some of these players that go into lock with a questionable tag next to their name get a little bit less ownership when their game eventually starts, even if they're playing. So keep an eye on that. A lot of times players, especially not as sharp players, just say, I don't want to worry about late swap. I'm just Xing this guy out. He's not going to my lineups. And then he plays, and that ownership is a little deflated by the time that game comes around.
That's a really good point.
Yeah, that's one of the things where late swap can give you a pretty big edge just by having the confidence that you can have those questionable players in there, because you'll be able to manage as long as you stay on top of the news and get out from that. We've got a couple questions, 2 questions we actually answer with the same thing. So Matt from SaberSim via Slack asked for advice on managing stat correction tilt. He went from winning 100K to winning 15K on stat correction last night. And then Clement Davis said, if Giant Squid can give us his special recipe, we'll all be happy. And so his special recipe is actually the answer to Matt's question, and that is whiskey. So that is the answer to handling stat correction tilt. Going to the next one. This is a small slate specific question. Are some people think a lot about game stacking, stacking one game, hoping it goes off, or intentionally trying to spread it out across all the games? How do you guys all approach that?
Okay, so with basketball, there's kind of basically there's an event that causes positive correlation between players, and that's overtime or double overtime. Right. So there is definitely some merit to doing a game stack and banking on this game going to overtime and the other game not. So yeah, I mean, I don't know if you want to make every lineup a game stack, but it definitely makes sense theoretically to do game stack sometime and hope that you get that outcome where there's overtime. But I'm not sure what the probability of overtime is.
That's what I was curious.
I think it's like 2% or something like that. It's not that high.
I think it's a little higher.
I don't know. It's interesting math
it's obviously going to vary based on the disparity between teams.
Yeah,
and the spread too. So yeah, I don't know. It's an interesting angle for sure, and there's definitely some. It makes sense theoretically.
I don't really think about it. I think last year there was a situation where, for some reason, I forgot why, there was some reason last year where overtimes were getting bigger or something and were happening more, and there was something to that. But I feel like the attention that people use into game stacking, which we're already kind of going to take into account for you, since we're actually simulating the games, is just I wouldn't put any more effort into it, honestly.
That's exactly what I was going to say, right? Like with smart diversity at 10, and we're considering these extremely small buckets of simulations or just even single game simulations, the simulation events where overtime does take place on a 2-game slate is going to be represented well in your lineup pool anyway. Games where the Nuggets and Blazers go to overtime are going to be games where Lillard and Jokic and all these guys all have ceiling outcomes, and those are all represented in a single simulation. So
yeah, and there are also events where game stacking is going to guarantee, like if there's a huge blowout, like the team that lost, all those players are going to do horribly. And you're not going to have a winning lineup with the game stack in that situation. So there's also that. I mean, that's just another point, is there's a counter argument, which is if you game stack, you don't get the upside of blowouts.
Right. And this is the next question. I just want to make sure we get to it. I think we've already covered it, but I just want to touch back on it. So it's when small slates tend to have one obvious chalk high scoring game, what's the best way to gain leverage without full fading the studs? And I think we've talked kind of in the beginning and just throughout about the different ways you can take a stand. And so one of the big parts of leverage is truly just minimizing duplicates, which the most straightforward way of doing is lowering that maximum salary. Like Danny was saying, in a sport like NBA, where there aren't a ton of viable choices, you do want to be careful that you don't lower it too much. Because if this was baseball, within reason, as long as your guys are in the game, like they could all have a good night there, especially if they're against a star pitcher. The leverage is big enough that they can still get their home runs, they can still get their runs, they can get all their extra at-bats, all of that to make it worth it. Whereas in basketball, you do want to be careful, but in a showdown, lowering it by 500 or 600 can be reasonable. That's a great way to do it. But it's also just looking at some of those low-minute, high-upside plays that Max mentioned, where you're not necessarily directly fading someone, but you're just trying to find these slightly under-the-radar plays that you think the field isn't fully accounting for. And so looking at the chat, we also have a question from Tracy.
Could I just get to a question real quick? That was at the top, and it was just missed. It was from Randy Johnson.
Yep.
I think it was on the topic of basically when you're hunting for value plays, and he said, would it be ridiculous to look at 3-point leaders that are low salary? And I actually think that's actually kind of clever, is if you have someone who's a value play who literally is just like a huge three-point shooter, especially in DraftKings where you get a bonus for that. Those are high variance points. So, when you need someone to get about 18 points on these 2-game slates to possibly even be a winning play, I feel like that's actually interesting. So that's another thing that you could look at if you wanted to really get granular.
Yeah, just adding to that, I think it seems like there are some players like Damian Lillard, Trae Young, Steph Curry, where if they get hot from 3, they'll just start chucking it up like mad. And those players probably do have like a little more upside than other players. So I think that can be a decent angle to take if there's some like 3-point hot shot who you like.
Yeah, and then so Tracy asks, does it make more sense to change percentile or team total or individual projections to adhere to DraftKings rule, and which has more success at being unique? And so there's kind of a couple things buried in there. And so the way DraftKings works, to be compliant, you have to make changes to 2 or more players. The easiest way of doing that would be changing a team total or changing a projection, because the percentile, will impact every player on the slate. So that's like one click to meet that rule. Changing a team is going to affect everyone in that game. But I wouldn't take such a blunt tool just to be compliant with them. I think there are going to be ways you can add more value by kind of more fine-tuning the projections. So if the main concern is adhering to the DraftKings rule, I would just apply the concepts we've talked about to find players you can make some small tweaks to. As far as being unique, again, it's something where lowering salary is going to help you be unique. But yeah, like if you dramatically changed a team total and got it further away from Vegas, you would be more likely to be unique. But I wouldn't try to, again, like force something in there that dramatically changes the projections solely to be unique. I think percentiles can be interesting as a way to do that because you're still relying on the core underlying simulation results. And so I think that could be interesting. And I'm curious, like, what do you guys think about, not necessarily just to be unique, but what do you think about using percentiles on these smaller slates?
I've never used them, but the reason is that the percentiles are just an expression of the simulation data, which we're already using when we're building your lineups. So I think the numbers themselves are very interesting, but for actually building lineups, unless you're just like sort of using the builder in a different way than I do, where you're just using the percentiles and not really using the sliders or doing something else, like maybe you can do that. I don't really do that. But I think, what I heard in that question is partly how is the best way to adjust my lineup? Should I adjust exposures post-build? I mean, maybe this was not the question, but this is how I heard it was, should I adjust exposures post-build? Should I adjust player projections? Should I use percentiles? Should I adjust team projections? I think a lot of people use different things. Like I know Matt, when he uses the builder, he doesn't touch the projections and he just changes exposures. That's my understanding of what he does. I could be wrong. I like messing with projections a lot, especially because that's going to make it so my top lineups have the players that I really want. And I think it just depends on what you're comfortable with. I think there's many ways to use our product that are going to be winning ways to build lineups. And, it just is versatile. So it just depends on what you're comfortable with and what you want to do. If you really want to focus on balancing your lineups and making small tweaks and making sure you get this stack and another like 40% of this game stack and 50% of this game stack, which is great. That's something you're going to do in the post-build process that maybe that's what you like to do more. Or you can do what I was suggesting earlier in the video is really hunt for projections that you can change them, and then use that to do the majority of your work.
Yeah, and it all comes down to finding where you can add the most value to the process. And DraftKings obviously does have that limitation that requires you to make two changes. But I wouldn't try to be finding necessarily like a way around that, because I think if you're following the advice, if you're following the advice from the videos, to even some degree, you're going to naturally be making a couple of changes. And I think it's easy to get overwhelmed by all the possible changes that you can make and by trying to do research on all these players. And that's why, honestly, I think some of these smaller slates can be more interesting because there's fewer decisions to make, but it is important to make a few. So that's kind of thing is, I think for a standard DFS process, the DraftKings compliance rule really shouldn't be coming into play because you should be going in expecting to make a few changes. And I'd recommend checking out some of our other videos on some of the more straightforward ways of doing that while still adding value. And that's kind of where I would point people there. On the topic of uniqueness, though, when it comes to the captain for showdowns, there's been some people have talked about just Xing out the highest projected captain, potentially from both teams, to force more unique lineups. People have looked about going for a high ceiling, about high value, low owns, and try and differentiate somewhere else. Like there's a lot of different theories there. And I'm curious how you guys all think about that.
I think the Xing out the highest projected player in the captain is an interesting idea. I think sometimes if someone is really much higher projected than everyone else, then they truly are the most optimal captain pick, and you shouldn't fade them. God, I don't know. I mean, just using ownership fade and lowering salary is a good way to do it for sure.
I think. So I have a strong opinion, which is I think it really depends on the slate, and I think this is why doing a build just right off the bat and seeing what lineups are being produced by SaberSim is really smart, because it can kind of help you find the direction to go, right? Because if you see, okay, I'm getting like 100% of this player in the captain, and I have an ownership fade slider that's high, and that says to me, okay, like, if you weren't looking at that, you might just use the heuristic. Okay, I'm just going to fade the highest owned captain. And that would actually be stupid. Like our builder is telling you that you should do the exact opposite of that, right? But I think what can be really interesting is you do a build and you can see, okay, what types of lineups am I getting? Am I getting any lineups where we're punting the captain to fit in all these players? Does that make sense? Or are we getting a bunch of lineups where we're just spending up on the chalk and the captain, and do I need to go a different direction to be different, right? So I think that, or what value plays are we getting? So I think you should just look at how these lineups are being built to give you some ideas.
Yeah, I really like that point, Max. I like the idea in general of approaching these with a test build first, like we do on all of our main slates, and just see what the builder thinks is viable. Different games are going to play out differently, and there's going to be slates where maybe 60% of your lineups right off the bat don't feature one of those big name studs as the captain. And maybe at that point, you can adjust your exposures or tweak some projections there and get 100% of lineups that are using more of a value play in your captain spot. The one other thing I'll add too, players that are using a traditional optimizer that's just going to build lineups based on median projection are going to get more of players that project with a higher median projection. So looking at like the Portland and Denver game tonight, you've got Dame and Jokic at the top, both players that we have almost identical ceilings at the moment. And Jokic has a slightly higher salary. The field is likely to get a little bit more Lillard at captain. And I think you can find some success there. Just flipping the script. Those two players have very similar ceiling potential. And I think you're likely to see one player become a little more highly owned purely because median projection-based optimizers are going to give players more of those lineups.
Yeah, and so just to build on that, to give people context a little bit more on SaberSim, if you're not familiar as much, what we're doing is looking at all of the simulation results. We will simulate every single game, thousands of times, play by play. So we get a true range of outcomes that could happen in any of these games. And we use what we call the smart diversity slider to help sample some of those outcomes and make sure that the possibilities that we're factoring in your lineups are possibilities that could actually happen because they occurred in the simulations. Max has a really good video that digs deep into smart diversity. You can find that over on our YouTube channel, so I recommend checking that out. But that's also why you can use SaberSim as a bit of an advisor, where you can do a test build, which all we do for a test build is basically put in kind of a middle-of-the-road contest, hit build without making any adjustments, and to see what the exposures look like. Because to Max's point, we're looking at ownership. We're looking at how variance can impact this specific player and the games that they're in and all of that, and their correlations to other players. And if we're factoring all that in, if we have a high ownership fade and you're still getting 100% of that player, there's a reason for that. Whereas in a traditional optimizer, where it's just forcing in the mean projection of all the players, is trying to find the best combination of that, you can't read too much into it other than this is the combination of the highest average projections that fit under the salary cap. And that can be useful, but it just doesn't teach you much. It's not valuable as kind of a learning mechanism. And that's why, what Jordan was saying is that when you're able to find the spots like, oh, okay, like I'm actually not getting much of this highest owned guy because there is another player that's pretty close to him, and SaberSim's getting a good amount of in there, that's where it could make sense to bump them up a bit more and try to double down on that. We just got a question in Slack from Chris, and he's asking, do any of you guys deliberately allocate any of your lineups to specific game scripts? And I know that if you crank smart diversity all the way up to the top, which on a showdown, maybe in a 2-game slate, it might be already, you're kind of naturally building lineups around game scripts. But are you thinking about building lineups around a star injury, a massive blowout? And his example was something like game 1 in the finals last year when the Heat got blown out and Kendrick Nunn ended up being the key to the slate, and most people didn't even have him in their player pool. So is that something you think about? Do you think there is merit to thinking about that? Just what are your thoughts on that?
I think, specifically, I think the blowout angle is really interesting because there are certain players that if there's like a total blowout may play a lot. There may be a starter who would play in garbage time if they're a really young player or if a team has a lot of injuries. So I think there are, if you can theorize about what players may drastically benefit from a blowout, that could be an interesting angle to take, I think.
Just to add on top of that, I would say if I'm doing that, it's usually filtering, basically, like sort of just filtering together, seeing if I'm getting lineups with like pairs or trios of players that might benefit together or something, and then using the filters like that to take into account, either add lineups or remove lineups that I might not think intuitively or are as correlated in those situations.
And then, Danny, this one's for you specifically, and I think it's a good fit. When you late swap, do you prefer a single quick swap or a full late swap? And would that change if you were in, say, a handful of single entries and 3 maxes versus 20 max and 150 max? I know you do have something you put a lot of thought into.
So if you have time, always late swap. Quick swap is a really good tool where if you see news like with 2 minutes until lock and 1 minute to lock, you can do quick swap really fast and get an injured player out of your lineup. But if you have time, do the late swap because that's the real quantitative one. Quick swap is we're just going to take injured players out of your lineup and replace them with the best replacement as best we can, right? But late swap is we're going to really calculate what the new optimal lineups are based on how all the projections have changed.
I would say the only exception to this is if you are really attached to the structure of your lineups and you do not want to change them, do quick swap, right? But late, a lot of times it's actually better not to get too attached because the re-optimization of your lineups using late swap, it can be really valuable. So,
yeah, one thing I always think the more you can adjust your kind of mental image of what your lineups are to, these are the lineups I'm playing from the time that the first game starts to when the second game starts, the better. Because when you get attached to those lineups, even on full NBA slates in the regular season, when you get to attach to those lineups that you put in right at lock and then news breaks for that second round of games, if you're attached sometimes and you're doing quick swap or something like that, you might be reducing the overall EV of your lineups because you're not appropriately adjusting to the news. So especially when there's only 2 slates, right? Like if Chris Paul's out after lock tonight, something like that, that adjusts 50% of the games that are available on the slate. And if you fell in love with your lineup constructions early at lock, you might be hurting yourself overall.
This is definitely especially true for NBA on these shorter slates because one big injury, one big change will have a dramatic impact on the entire slate. And you can get a huge amount of edge just by reacting quickly to that and rebuilding your lineups around it. Whereas on bigger slates or in other sports that aren't as kind of star centered, it can, especially if you are someone who is going to be really getting everything dialed in just the way you want it, late swap can shake that up a bit, more so than you may want and more so than may be optimal, although it's probably never bad. But on these smaller slates, I think it's something where you want to be taking advantage of the most recent information because it just has such an outsized impact.
I do see a question in YouTube from our game stacking conversation that I think we missed. Braden asked, so is it bad to game stack? And I mean, guys, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think maybe the message here isn't so much that it's bad to game stack, nor is it good to game stack. It's kind of more of a neutral thing here, that you're going to capture the appropriate amount of game stacks with the high sport diversity. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah,
Max,
I think
muted.
Max is muted. I think it's possible that game stacking in basketball could just be bad. I think there is math to be done to prove if it's good or bad. It's hard to tell. It just depends on what the chance of overtime is and how much better those players perform because of overtime, and because there's downsides to game stacking too, because getting blown out means the times where you have a blowout, the losing team is really, really going to do badly.
I would push back on that. I think game stacking is a net positive, but what I was saying, I mean, and we could argue about this, but what I was saying more is SaberSim, like, this is literally the purpose of simulating the games, so we can take this into account. So putting extra effort into it, you probably are going to end up overvaluing it than valuing it correctly, and that's going to be a net negative, especially for your time. So I just wouldn't focus on it more beyond than what we're doing for you already.
Right, because by looking at those simulations, it literally a game is played out. And so we can see, okay, this was a blowout. How did it impact the games? Does it make sense to play multiple people from this game? What is the impact there? And we'll do that thousands of times for each of the lineups. And that's where to Max's point, we'll automatically account for it. And if it's good, you'll get more of it. If it's not good, you won't get much of it. And it's something that you don't want to force beyond that, I think is fair to say. And then maybe we'll get Will to do some math and look into some of the other numbers too.
I would also say, if you like game stacking, tonight's the night, because you're just going to get them regardless of whether you want them or not. There's 2 games, so you'd have to put an effort not to get them.
Right, and I think that really is just to hammer home the point. What makes SaberSim so powerful is that it's not that you should just completely ignore these kind of considerations and just, you don't have to think at all. You just click a few buttons. There's a lot of power under the hood. And because of that, you don't have to do as much. You don't have to program hundreds of rules and dozens of groups and all this stuff to get lineups that make sense. We're able to leverage our simulation data to give you that. And that's why it's so powerful, because then all that extra time that you get, you can focus on adding value to the process by looking at the areas that we've talked about today. And I mean, the big ones, just to summarize, are at the highest level, it's the smaller the slate, the bigger the stand, the bigger the tweaks you're going to have to make if you want a significant edge. You just have to do more because there's less to work with, especially in a low variance sport like basketball. And so the easiest tools of doing that is leaving a lot of salary on the table. Danny was saying, generally speaking, again, like, look at how pricing is, look at what lineups look like as a test build without making any adjustments. But like, generally speaking, on a showdown, you can feel safe leaving $600 or $500 on the table. And as more games get added, I'd probably knock off $100, $200 as you go up. The other way is just simply fading the high owned plays. And then the last one that we really dug into was finding those low minute, high upside plays and taking aggressive stand there. But there's a lot of options out there. Hopefully we've covered a lot of those in depth for you. If you have any other questions, though, feel free to keep posting them in the office hours Slack channel or sending them over to us at support@sabersim.com. This was a lot of fun, guys. Jordan, Danny, Max, thank you guys for helping out. And thanks everyone for attending. We'll be back next week with another strategy session. And so if there are any topics you want us to do a deep dive on like this, let us know. We were getting a little list going, and then, yeah, this is going to be a weekly thing. So we can just keep putting out valuable content to help everyone level up their game. But yeah, thanks everybody.
Thanks.
Thanks.